Thanks for attending this lecture. I'm really glad to introduce tonight's lecture by Sara Franceschelli, which is called Morphogenesis and Generic Dynamical Landscape. As the issue of both morphogenesis is one which was very important and very present in the last 20 years of architectural debate, but also because the issue of dynamic systems is becoming more and more important in everyday life, not only for architecture, but everywhere around us. For example, in the internet, traffic, in various physical or non-physical phenomena, like traffic jams on highways or all of these different things, which in most of the cases implies some concepts which are coming from the theory of dynamical systems. So the very interesting things tonight is that Sara Franceschelli will create interesting relationship between what is happening in the discipline of architecture and the very scientific and sometimes mathematical and physical nature of the dynamical systems. But the nice aspect is that Sara Franceschelli is a physicist. Therefore, I believe she will have a slightly different look at these concepts. And most of all, she knows very precisely and intimately what dynamical systems are. So Sara Franceschelli is physicist. She was trained and she graduated at the University of Bologna in Italy. Then she joined Paris, where she graduated with a PhD in epistemology and in history of science. And she spent most of her time since then in working on the relationship between precisely what she calls dynamical landscapes and the concept of morphogenesis. So she went back to the early 20th century theoretical biology, if I'm right, and she's proposing very interesting hypotheses about the interpretation of contemporary architecture through the glasses of this analysis. So, welcome, Sara.
Thank you, Philippe, for this kind introduction. I was trained as a physicist indeed, but I am working as an epistemologist, and I will present today an epistemological point of view on the relation between morphogenesis and dynamical systems via this image of dynamic landscapes. And I will try to instantiate this vision with respect to design questions. But before beginning, I would like to thank also Professor Frédéric Miguerou for his invitation. I am very happy to be here lecturing in this School of Architecture because, as I hope to show by my talk, I really think that there are questions that can live both in a space of reflection about mathematics, physics, theoretical biology, but in spaces concerning design too, at different level and scales. Well, so as an epistemologist working on dynamical systems, I am very interested in conceptual practices that can emerge by a micro-analysis of case studies And somehow I take some distances with respect big macro historical pictures to give more attention to way of reasoning or of making sense that one can see if one looks in details to case study concerning particular scientific questions. As a matter of fact, I've been invited some years ago to teach in a school of applied art in Paris, Les Arts Déco, and to teach a subject called morphostructure, and also to run a research program on the topic of morphogenesis and morphodynamics. And in this context, I became very interested in the practices and the writings, theoretical writings, of, coming from contemporary architecture. One of the first things that I discovered was the pioneering exhibition organized by Frédéric Migarou, non-standard, architecture non-standard au Centre Pompidou. And I had the chance of visiting for a short period the laboratory of Mark Barry at RMIT in Melbourne. And at that time, I read a very known paper by Mark Barry, Between Surface and Substance. And what I took as the main idea for me from this beautiful paper was that one of the merits of the use of the digital media in architectural design is to enable a kind of re-engaging of mathematical thinking. And of course, this mathematical thinking was, and it is still, for me, at the core of reasoning in morphogenesis, since the tentative to imitate growing or diffusion processes is one of the leading principles in the study of morphogenesis. And this can be seen also a leading principle in morphogenetic design, since one can think at processes or structures as shared properties by mathematics, by nature, and by artifact. And this is a perspective that informed, since the origin, research on morphogenesis. For example, the well-known Darcy Thompson, in his On Growth and Form, writes, cell and tissue, shell and bone, leaf and flower are so many portions of matter, and it is in obedience to the laws of physics that the particles have been moved, molded, and conformed. The problems of form are, in the first instance, mathematical problems. The problems of growth are essentially physical problems, and the morphologist is ipso facto a student of physical science. Well, here it is very interesting to see that Darcy Thompson gives a lot of importance to the physical laws on the growing processes, and he thinks that one should not consider only the effect of natural selection. And for example, just this image by Stéphane Leduc, that in his La Vie Synthétique produced this kind of osmotic landscapes thanks to chemical reactions, goes in this sense of being interested in physical or chemical processes that can give rise to forms that are analog of living forms. And this perspective informed, of course, the research of architects like, for example, Frei Otto, with his work on minimal surfaces, as you know. Well, in this context, I would like to ask, as a question, what is morphogenetic in morphogenetic design? When we want to produce not a form, but the genesis of form, what is the morphogenetic principle? And the idea that I had a little bit was that from the time of Darcy Thompson, or also maybe of Frei Otto, some novelties entered the scene, both in science and in design, at least two, the digital media and a perspective of dynamical systems. And I tried to work on this question through this research program inspired by an image coming from the history of theoretical biology, the image of epigenetic landscape, but thought from a dynamical systems point of view. We will see what I mean. Before going inside this program, just another reference, more recent reference to the work of architects working today in research. Well, I was impressed by the work of Philippe Morel, for example, his chair that he conceived thanks to algorithm and thanks to new possibility of 3D printing could make this chair exist. Or I know the work of Alisa Andrasek on this production of a variety of morphological objects. From the point of view of the epistemological reasoning on this practice, I was very interested in this statement coming from a paper by Achim Menges. In computational morphogenesis, form is not defined through a sequence of drawing or modeling procedures, but generated through algorithmic rule-based process. In computational morphogenesis, the genotypic definition unfolds a performative phenotypic material systems. So the last part of the quotation, you will see, it is really, in a way, could be referred to the image of the landscape that I will show you. So we will discuss about this image, which is not a mathematical model. It is purely a mental image coming from the history of theoretical biology that I suggest to consider as a dynamical device of, if you prefer in French, a dispositif. So the idea is to read this image that I will show you from a structural but dynamical point of view. And the image has been introduced at the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 40s, by an embryologist, Conrad Hall Waddington, who was also one of the promoters of theoretical biology. And this image is very important for me because, for different reasons, as we will see. But in any case, René Thom, the mathematician René Thom, father of catastrophe theory, wrote in the paper which can be considered the founding paper of the theory, that the image of epigenetic landscapes was, for him, really a source of inspiration and also an object to work on in order to develop his catastrophe theory, which is a mathematical theory that comes from René Thome's research on topology and differential analysis on the problem of structural stability. We will see what these mean for René Thome. What I would like to say is just that for René Thome, morphogenesis has a very wide and general acceptation. He considers morphogenesis is a process that creates or destroys forms without taking into account not the nature, material or not, of the substrate of the considered forms, neither the nature of the forces causing this changing. So we see, with respect, for example, the work of D'Arcy Thompson, who inspired also deeply René Thome, a switch towards another degree of generality here that I think is bound to this perspective of dynamical systems. Let's come to the image. This is the first image that has been proposed by Waddington in a book of 1940, Organizers and Genes. And the image has been, it is a painting. Waddington had a lot of friends in the artistic world of that time. And also, at the end of his life, Waddington wrote a book, Behind Appearance, on the relations between art and science from his point of view, especially during the 20th century. In this book, he wrote about a lot of different aspects of physics or chemistry or biology of his time. He never wrote about his own work and his image of landscape that, in my opinion, is so adapted to create a dialogue between science and let's say, in general, creators or designers. In any case, this first image has been painted by John Piper, and the perspective is a little bit difficult to understand at the first sight. Indeed, one has to read the image in this sense. At the top, one should imagine the sea or the ocean, for example, and one should see in this image a river that flows toward the sea, thanks to a kind of bifurcating path, yes, a bifurcating pathways. And there is, this image is qualified, as I told before, as a mental image. A representation by Waddington, by a diagram of the developmental system. Waddington knows perfectly that it is not more than an image, but my idea is that an image that could help in thinking if one has a visual mind. The idea is, it is my point of view as a reader of this image, is that this image calls for a mathematization. And Waddington, during his life, tried to have contact with mathematicians, modelers, and he was very happy to exchange ideas with René Thome, as we will see. Later, in 1957, Waddington uses again this image, but under another form. Here, the landscape, the hilly surface, is represented in a way that one could consider more scientific. This kind of undulated surface makes it is easy to think immediately, for example, to a field in physics. Anyway, in this image, we have a ball that who is ready to roll down, and that can choose different pathways. The hilly surface represents, and Waddington writes these, represents the fertilized egg. And the pathways taken by the ball represent possible pathways for embryonic development. And we should think to this image as working at different scale. For example, at the scale of the tissue differentiation, and also at the scale of organ differentiation. I would say also another thing about the Waddington thinking. Waddington created also the term, introduced, maybe not created, but introduced this term epigenetics. And in his definition of 1942, he defines epigenetics as the branch of biology which studies the causal interaction between genes and their products, which bring the phenotype into being. So we can see here really that Waddington is interested in the passage from genotype to phenotype, and this passage is seen by Waddington from the point of view of the interactions between genes and also their products. So it is not a linear vision, but d'emblée a very relational vision. And we can see this translated visually, this idea, in a second image, which is absolutely to consider with the other one if we want to understand the potentialities of Waddington epigenetic landscapes. This part is the hidden part of the landscape. We see represented the system of interaction between the genes modeling the epigenetic landscape. Of course, if we look at this image without considering the semantics, genes, chemical interactions, possible pathway for development, but just the structure of this object, we can immediately appreciate some properties, for example, bound to the variation of tensions of the strings. One can imagine that if a tension varies, the general form of the landscape change. For example, opening a new pathway for development. But on the contrary, one can also imagine that thanks to a kind of compensation between different guy ropes, a change in this hidden part will not be transferred in the upper part. So in this case, we can imagine a kind of robustness that can be associated to this structure. I should underline that Waddington does not use the word robustness. It is a contemporary term. Waddington liked to create terms, and to speak about his landscape, he introduced the term cryot, which is indeed one pathway. He preferred to call the pathways cryots, and sometimes cryots, sometimes with an H, sometimes without. But the idea is that it is a necessary path of development. And he also introduced another term to speak about this property of, before I used the term robustness, but Waddington spoke about homeoresis. I just read very quickly some part of this quotation coming from Strategy of the Genes. As a matter of fact, if a process of embryonic development is disturbed, it usually returns to normality sometime before reaching the adult condition. Such a system exhibits a tendency towards a certain kind of equilibrium, which is restored after disturbance. But this equilibrium is not centered on a static state, but rather on a direction or pathway of change. We might speak of such an equilibrium property as a condition of homeoresis, reo to flow, on the analogy with the well-known expression homeostasis, which is appropriate when it is an unchanging state which is maintained. So for Waddington, in order to speak of development, we have to think to a kind of stability which is a kind of dynamical stability, not only a stability toward an end fixed state. So if we look at these two parts of the metaphor, of the image of the epigenetic landscape, we can speak of a kind of composite metaphor, very ambitious. Image can say more than, certainly than a mathematical model at that time, but maybe also more than written text, because in a very synthetic manner, they point out to different aspects of development. The first one is cellular differentiation. As I said before, we can imagine both tissue differentiation or organ differentiation, but it is quite interesting from the point of view of a possible expression in mathematical terms of the image. I come just back 1 minute. Waddington uses in his book, Strategy of the Genes, the idea of the exaggeration of initial differences for the ball, that could, from this point of view, choose between different pathways because of this property that today we could perhaps call sensibility to initial conditions. So Waddington was at that time very aware of novelty in the world of mathematics, and he was aware of this property of unstable dynamical systems. And there is another aspect, which is the aspect of defined by the notions of cryod and of homeoresis. Waddington wrote also about canalization and buffering. and robustness, I put this term, but it is the contemporary term to speak about this idea of stability again with respect to some perturbation, but it is not a Waddington term. And finally, as we saw, the hidden part of the image also insists on the role of interactions between the genes and their product. So the connotation of epigenetics as Waddington introduced it. Well, as a matter of fact, when René Thom wrote the first paper on catastrophe theory, he had a very interesting correspondence with Waddington that was the editor of the book coming from a symposium towards a theoretical biology that Waddington himself organized, inviting a lot of mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists who were interested in founding a theoretical biology. And we have not the time now to analyze these correspondence, but what is emerging from these analyses is that there is a kind of mismatch between the two scientists about the use of alternative stationary states versus time-extended cryots and morphogenetic field. I think that it was clear enough the point of view of Waddington on the difference between a kind of dynamic stability along a pathway and a stability with respect to final state. But just to go very quickly on this point, on a general, from a syntactic point of view, we could say that for Waddington, in this image, one should think to different variables and parameters depending on the spatio-temporal scale one imagines. This is not present in Thom models, which provide a very general description of the variations of the form. And about the notion of stability and robustness, for Waddington, there is this property of homeoresis, which is proper only to development at every scale. And for Thom, there is this important property that we will see, the idea of structural stability, which is for Thom, for René Thom, a property of observable object, living or not, that gives an access to the study of their morphogenesis. So for Thom, it is a very important property. And he takes this property from the development of dynamical system theory. The idea of structural stability is the following one. If we consider a function, we can say that it is structurally stable if, for a small perturbation of the function has the same topological properties that the previous one. For Thom, this is an attribute of every observable form. And this point of view, even if one can criticize it from the point of view of its expression in very generalized mathematical terms, but I will not speak about that here. It is at the origin a very curious and ambitious concept because proposed by Andronov and Pontryagin during the 1930s. Because the idea is to express inside a mathematical theory the criteria to say if a mathematical model is good or not to represent a physical system. And the idea, qualitative idea, is the one I expressed before. So we see in Thom, I like to look at Thom at least for what I am interested here. I mean a dialogue between a mathematician and a biologist about the possibility of expressing in mathematical terms an image that would like to talk about processes, a process of development. In this case, what I like to think to Thom as someone who inserts himself in this tradition of dynamical system theory without entering in the details of his catastrophe theory. And this vocation to a dynamical systems point of view is present in Waddington writings too. For example, in Strategy of the Genes, there is this image that for Waddington is a phase space of the developing embryo. And what is very striking is that indeed in the case of development, phase space is something that is growing with the object that should, in a sort, represent. This is different with respect phase space in mathematics or in physics. So we are here really looking at some at a dialogue that presents some divergences. And the differences are, for me, very interesting because they put on the table the qualitative reasoning about these systems. And the development of qualitative reasoning, but in a very rigorous way, has been so important for the further use of dynamical system theory to think to problems of the physical world, for example, transition to turbulence, for example, meteorological forecasting or oscillating chemical reactions, thanks to a very important paper of 1971 by David Ruel and Floris Stakens. I will not go into the details of this part of the fascinating history of chaos theory. I will just take one consideration of David Ruel on idealization that he wrote in a paper, in a further paper. David Ruel says, in linear physics, physicists used the model of harmonic oscillator. In the physics à la Landau, which was the way in which turbulence was thought before the contribution of Ruel and Stakens, physicists reason thanks to approximations to deal with nonlinearity. But finally, thanks to qualitative dynamics, thanks to dynamical system theory, it is possible to treat nonlinearity without approximation and in a rigorous way, even if, David Ruel says, maybe the first way to do physics, linear physics, is more useful for practical predictions when it works. And the degree of usefulness is going down when we approach dynamical system theory. But well, there is a shift toward the possibility of treating rigorously these nonlinear interactions. And here I go very quickly just to say that, indeed, Ruel and Takens in this paper introduce the idea of strange attractor, that it is very important in chaos theory, and they can do that thanks to concept and tools that comes from dynamical system theory, in particular the idea of bifurcations and an idea of genericity, which is a mathematical idea, quite polysemic indeed. But just to give a very schematic idea of the shift that these introduced, that this point of view introduced in physics, I can say that we assist to this passage from the study of the properties of a given dynamical system to the study of the properties of classes of systems defined on the basis of their structural stability. And in practice, because we are interested in these practices, physicists tried and verified, thanks to the variation of parameters in numerical studies or in experiment, tried to verify if their system was structurally stable, and also they studied the properties of simple generic models to try and get some qualitative pictures to understand dynamic behaviors. And also here I'm doing something very dangerous. That could be considered a form of anachronism, but I don't want to say that Alan Turing did the same things in his seminal paper on morphogenesis of 1952. I just want to underline that when we look to practices in particular case studies, sometimes we found similar ways of reasoning, even if they are not expressed in the same terms, even if they don't use the same tools that sometimes do not exist. But we can find, anyway, a similarity of way of reasoning of conceptual practices. First thing which is quite interesting is that Turing in his paper wanted to provide a model of cellular differentiation of the growing embryo, and this reference from biology was Waddington's work on a particular concept, the concept of evocator. We don't enter in these details, but I want to say that the concept that Turing introduces in his paper is the idea of morphogenes, and Turing says the word being intended to convey the idea of a form producer, and he adds, it is not intended to have any exact meaning, but it is simply the kind of substance concerned in this theory. So we see here a very relational way of thinking too. And just to finish this small consideration about the work of Turing on morphogenesis. In his paper, Turing works both on linear and nonlinear models. For linear model, in a linear approximation, he can use an analytic approach. But for nonlinear models, he uses numerical calculus for a particular case study. And to speak of this case study, he uses the expression, the imaginary organism. So I would say maybe one can see here that the use of the digital tool can be associated to this imagination that sometimes work on generic dynamics, even if, of course, he never used this term. Well, just to come to the dynamic properties of landscape, I would like to say that Waddington and Thom had a lot of, wrote a lot of letters about their respective interpretations. And in a letter of December of 1967, René Thom put these pictures of a plaster model that he produced, thinking about a landscape. And the only dynamical thing that we can see here is provided by the flow of, for example, water or a fluid that could be poured from one landscape to another. This landscape, you will see, it is more like a potential well, so in this direction than a hilly surface, like in the Waddington case. And also, René Thom also made a small dessin à la main to represent his idea. And so I thought it could be very interesting to imagine really dynamical landscapes. And this motivated this to choose this image as a kind of, at the core of this research program about the dynamical properties of landscape. If a landscape is composed by maxima, minima, we can ask what is the nature of the equilibria characterizing the landscape? Which are the properties of stabilities, of robustness? At which spatial temporal scales we should imagine these dynamics? And of what the landscape speaks, indeed. So the idea of performative associated to this image is bound to this question. The idea is to try and imagine dynamical devices that could be instances of some of the dynamical properties of an imaginary landscape. So the point of view is to take a distance from this, for now, from each kind of semantics or interpretation of the landscape, to concentrate only in its pragmatics, indeed. Well, with this idea of mind, the first things that I tried to build myself was just the idea of a dynamics of balls on a landscape. But of course, the dynamics was very, very simple. And we tried with students at ENSAD and with colleagues, especially my colleague Yves Mailleux, which is an architect who works on tense membranes, to produce a dynamical device that was inspired exactly by this correspondence between Thom and Waddington. And let's say if I can, well, sometimes it doesn't work, but I will do that. Okay. Here we can. Yeah, we can see this device that in which we see that the position of minima and maxima change in time, and also we assist to a kind of deployment of a form, and if we wait enough, we will see that the initial form can be found again. But what was quite interesting for us in this experience was that immediately we saw that we should reason, we should build analogies between this image of landscapes that we had in mind and what we wanted to build. Here, for example, there are rotating bars, 4 rotating bars that, and also 2 other pointers of control that are a little bit our genetic hidden system to control the development of the structure. And just to illustrate this idea that working on these properties of landscapes is a way to to open a kind of analogical reasoning. I'll show you another devices that has been okay. Excuse me. Okay. No, here. I don't know if I can open it. Let's try here. Maybe. Okay. It has changed a little bit. Okay, so this is another, a completely different device that has been thought to answer the following question: what if the all in the landscape could interact with the rest of the landscape? For example, if the ball could interact with the pathway that defines the walls of the criots. And this idea and this experience has been proposed by 2 students, Maya Daboville and Ferdinand Dervieux, who worked with us. To try to answer to this particular question that maybe is not the first question one can see in the image of Waddington, but that can be asked if we just concentrate on the dynamical potentiality of the landscape. And I should maybe you would like to know what are here the hidden system of these things. And we go here again. Here, we worked with a magnetic fluid, indeed. And the parameters to control the system are very simply, well, above all, of course, the gravitational field and the magnetic interaction between this magnetic fluid and some magnets that Maya had around his fingers, in some of his fingers, and then the mechanical pressure then he could exert on two membranes that controlled this device. So here again, the hidden genes are of a very different form. Also, about the dynamical perspective that I tried to introduce you before, I want to say a last thing, is that here we tried and recognized if recurrent scenarios could present in connection, in relation to certain kind of actions on the device. This notion of scenario is very important, for example, to understand the transition to turbulence of, or to other strange behaviors in chaos theory. And it is defined as a generic sequence of bifurcations under a variation of a control parameter. And the idea was, can we find something more or less like that? Can we find that some particular action determines a certain kind of behavior that will be followed by another kind of behavior if another particular action is acted? So it is a very qualitative way to ask about very simple experimental systems, questions that come from a very, from a very technical and abstract work. And for me, what it was very interesting in this work with students was a kind of dialogue, a kind of circle that I hope to be more of the kind of the virtuous circle, in the sense that I proposed some questions, and the devices themselves made us think of other, a little bit more sophisticated questions, always asked thanks to analogy in a qualitative language, but it is a way to think and practice difficult things together. So I will stop here. Thank you.
So you briefly mentioned that Alan Turing came up with the theory about embryology, the mathematical theory. Does that still stand true today? I know there's been some... I'm wondering if that theory still holds today, and how strong that mathematical theory is in terms of embryology, using reaction diffusion.
Well, indeed, what I showed were Turing's intentions, because he wanted to write down a model for the grown embryo, but he knew perfectly that he had to limitate the problem for this paper. And so he wrote, he concentrated himself on pattern formation, spatial pattern formation. So even if he was inspired by the idea of the embryo as a whole, it just worked on pattern formation. And this has been, people have worked on that, and it has been proven that one can find this kind of pattern formation. But for the moment, as far as I know, not for the case of all the embryos. And the idea was to present questions about landscape, in their case from evolutionary theory. So in their case it was more about what one can call adaptive landscape, not epigenetic landscape, but morphologically there are these minimum and maximum. And my colleague Yves Mailleux works on tensed membranes. So at the beginning, it was so easy to reason in terms. That in another case, we worked with an artist, Anne Ferrer, who is working with Enketo. So it depends a lot with about the partners, because these workshops are thought as a dialogue. But in the case of the magnetic fluid, the idea came from the two students, Maria and Ferdinand. They had, in my opinion, this very good idea of thinking of a total interaction of all with all, and the idea came from this. No, the other liquid, well, the dark one was the fluid, but the other is a kind of, how to say in English, un solvant pour la vaisselle, produit vaisselle, to wash dishes. Okay. But it was extremely empirical, they tried a lot. So I think that in any case, for the moment we work on kind of analog systems, but the idea should be to work parallel with systems that one can control digitally and say more, say something about the analogy between these analog systems.
I have a question regarding the structural stability. Can we make a direct transposition or parallel between the structural stability and the mathematical level, which is defining at some point actually the distinction between different kind of system? I mean, some form, let's say, partially predictable and some completely chaotic. Can we make a transposition between this idea and the structural stability on a more mechanical level?
I think that well, you mean stability of the building, for example?
Yes, or yeah, a building, or for example, I know that when we build a very thin shell, for example, concrete shell, in concrete, the thinner they become, the less predictable they are in terms of stability. Precisely. So, can we explain this lack of predictability directly through this theory of through this mathematical stability?
I think no, because indeed I like this dialogue between an extremely theoretical mind as René Thom and a biologist who made experiences in embryology like Waddington, because we see really all the different, the two extremes in a sense. And for Thom, he always held this property as very important. To him, we could observe things only thanks to this property. But from a pure mathematical point of view, theorems had been developed during the 50s. So before the development of catastrophe theory, and Thom knew then, that limited the possibility of classifying all the systems in terms of the property of their stability if we go in a dimension bigger than 2. So, but Thom knew that. Anyway, I want to say one thing, because this question is extremely interesting, because reasons of structural stability are used even later in a lot of very theoretical papers. For example, the paper of David O'Buell and a lot of works of physicists that worked on chaos theory. And what is very interesting, in my opinion, is that in many cases, through different strategies or tools, like for example, Poincaré sections, they put themselves in the situation of reasoning in 2 or 1 dimension. So in very simple cases, and in these very simple cases, considerations of structural stability hold. So it is a very fine tuning on the good situation to find the way of reasoning. It is not something, a kind of package that you have at work.
Was Waddington a former mathematician?
No, and he writes himself, I don't know a lot about mathematics, and René Thom, because this correspondence has been published, René Thom published in a kind of collection of works in which there is his first founding papers. And René Thom interprets this dialogue as a difference in mathematical cultures. He says, we don't understand each other, because if Waddington understood me, he would agree with me that his property of homeostasis, it is just the property that a system which is structurally stable has going towards its attractor. This is Thom's interpretation. And Waddington has no difficulties in admitting that his culture in mathematics is not developed enough. But I think that it is not the only reason, because I think that indeed there are theoretical questions that are often by this misunderstanding. It is not just a question of language. And also, I have to say, about Waddington, that Waddington was not a mathematician himself, but promoted a lot work of other mathematicians, for example, Brian Goodwin, that prepared a postdoc in Edinburgh on theoretical biology, and also another student, Edward Caxel, that worked on metabolic networks under the impulse of Waddington. So Waddington understood perfectly the importance of nonlinear equations. And also, I didn't say this, but Waddington was a reader of cybernetics. And the chapter in which he introduces this image, the title is A Cybernetic of Development. And he says, I don't know what is, after all, this epigenetic machine. He uses the term machine. Well, I think that I like this image because there are a lot of I don't know around, around it.